At 81, Gideon Vale had learned that some regrets become quieter with age. Not smaller, just quieter. For more than half a century, he had carried one particular regret without ever allowing himself to speak about it for too long. Evelyn Marlowe, the woman he had loved before life became complicated. The woman whose engagement ring had once rested on her finger. The woman who had walked away from him 57 years ago, believing he had chosen another woman over her. Gideon had never corrected her, and for most of his life, he had convinced himself that silence was the price he deserved to pay. Until the morning a solicitor placed a document in front of him and brought Evelyn's name back into his life. The office was quiet when Gideon arrived. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows, and the old clock above the fireplace seemed louder than usual. Across the desk, the solicitor unfolded several pages. Gideon expected to see the details of an ordinary estate. Instead, he saw the name Ashcombe, Theodore Ashcombe. He had never heard the name before. The solicitor explained that Theodore Ashcombe, a wealthy and private businessman who had died several months earlier, had left behind a substantial estate. Among the properties was Ashcombe House, a historic country estate that had remained in the Ashcombe family for generations, but Theodore had left specific instructions concerning its ownership. The property, together with a substantial trust, was to be transferred to one person, Evelyn Marlowe. Gideon stared at the page. For several seconds, he couldn't breathe properly. Evelyn. After 57 years, her name had suddenly appeared in a room he had never expected to hear it again. But then he noticed something else. A second name. His own. Gideon Vale. His hand moved toward the document, but stopped before touching it. For one brief moment, Gideon wondered whether Evelyn had somehow remembered him in her final arrangements. Perhaps the woman he had once loved had carried a small piece of their past with her all these years. Perhaps she had forgiven him. Perhaps, the solicitor quietly interrupted his thoughts. The inheritance, he explained, had nothing to do with generosity. Gideon looked up. There was something in the solicitor's expression that made the room feel suddenly colder. Theodore Ashcombe had left instructions that concerned both Evelyn and Gideon. And those instructions could not be understood without knowing what happened between them 57 years ago. Gideon's eyes returned to the document. He had spent his entire adult life trying not to revisit that night. Now a dead man's final wishes were forcing the past back into his hands. And Gideon had no idea why. Across town, Evelyn Marlowe was standing in the small garden behind her modest home. There was nothing about her surroundings that suggested she had just inherited a fortune. Her house was old but carefully maintained. The curtains were faded. The wooden fence needed repairing. A small collection of flower pots lined the back steps. Evelyn preferred it that way. She had spent decades learning how to live without needing much from anyone. At 79, she had become comfortable with quiet, perhaps too comfortable. Every morning she watered the same flowers. Every afternoon she read beside the same window, and every evening she placed a cup of tea beside an empty chair that no one had occupied in years. She had never explained why. That morning, however, her routine was interrupted by a telephone call. It was her solicitor. The transfer had finally been completed. Ashcombe House now belonged to her. So did the trust. Everything Theodore had arranged was now legally hers. Evelyn closed her eyes. For someone who had just inherited a fortune, there was no excitement in her expression. No smile. No celebration. Only a long, exhausted silence. Because Evelyn had known this day would come. She had simply hoped she would never have to face what came with it. She looked toward the old wooden gate at the edge of her garden. For a moment, she remembered herself at 22, young, hopeful, certain that love could survive anything. Then she remembered the night that belief disappeared. Her hand tightened around the phone. She quietly told her solicitor that she never wanted the inheritance to become public. Not yet. There were things people didn't know, things Theodore had spent decades protecting, and things Evelyn had spent even longer trying to forget. Gideon, meanwhile, returned home carrying a copy of the document. His daughter, Rosalind, immediately noticed something was wrong. She had spent years watching her father become increasingly private as he grew older. Gideon had never been a cold man, but there was a room inside him that nobody had ever been allowed to enter. Rosalind had always assumed that room belonged to his first marriage. She knew very little about the woman he had loved before her mother. Only a name, Evelyn. Gideon rarely spoke it, but that afternoon, Rosalind noticed an old photograph lying on the table. It showed a young man standing beside a young woman beneath a flowering tree. Gideon's face was almost unrecognizable. He was smiling, really smiling. Beside him stood Evelyn. Rosalind had never seen her father look at anyone the way he looked at that photograph. There was no bitterness in his eyes, only grief, the kind of grief that had survived long enough to become part of a person's identity. Gideon picked up the photograph and held it carefully. He had kept it for 57 years. He had moved houses, changed jobs, lost friends, lost his parents, lost his wife, watched his daughter grow into a woman, and somehow, through all of it, that photograph had remained, not because he wanted to live in the past, but because a part of him had never stopped wondering what his life might have looked like if he had made a different choice. 57 years earlier, Evelyn had believed she knew exactly what her future would be. She and Gideon were young and deeply in love. They had plans. They had a small apartment they hoped to rent after their wedding. They had talked about children. They had talked about traveling. They had even argued over what color they would paint the kitchen. Their dreams were ordinary. That was what made them feel so real. Then, only weeks before their wedding, something changed. Evelyn began noticing that Gideon was becoming distant. He stopped answering some of her calls. He started disappearing for long periods. And then one evening, she saw him with another woman. The sight destroyed something inside her. She didn't know who the woman was. She didn't know what they were discussing. She only knew what it looked like. Gideon stood close to her, close enough for Evelyn to believe that every promise he had made was a lie. She waited for an explanation. It never came. The next morning, Evelyn took off her engagement ring. She placed it on the table where Gideon would find it. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no desperate plea. She simply walked away. And that silence became the beginning of 57 years of misunderstanding. What Evelyn never knew was that the woman she had seen beside Gideon was connected to something far more complicated than romance. And what Gideon never understood was that his decision to remain silent would hurt Evelyn far more deeply than any confession could have. But that truth would remain buried for decades, until Theodore Ashcombe decided to disturb it. Back in the present, Gideon returned to the solicitor's office. He demanded answers. Why was Evelyn receiving Theodore's fortune? Why was his name included? And why had Theodore specifically mentioned the night he and Evelyn separated? The solicitor remained cautious. There were documents he could not release yet. There were instructions that had to be followed. But he finally revealed one thing. Evelyn had known this day would come. She had personally requested that Gideon be given an opportunity to hear the truth from her. Not from a solicitor, not from a letter, from Evelyn herself. Gideon sat motionless. For 57 years, he had imagined what it would be like to see Evelyn again. Sometimes he imagined anger, sometimes tears, sometimes nothing at all. But he had never imagined that a dead man's inheritance would be the reason they met again. The solicitor gave him Evelyn's address. Gideon placed the paper inside his coat. For several minutes, he remained seated. Then he stood. At 81, his hands were no longer as steady as they once had been, but that afternoon, they trembled for another reason. Fear. Not fear of Evelyn's anger, fear of discovering that the story he had told himself for more than half a century had never been the whole truth. By evening, Gideon was standing outside Evelyn's home. He almost turned around. The house looked ordinary, peaceful, nothing like the place where he had imagined finding the woman he had once loved. He walked toward the door, raised his hand, paused, then knocked. Inside, Evelyn froze. She had known this moment might come. She simply hadn't known whether she would be strong enough when it did. She walked slowly toward the door. Her hand rested on the handle. For one moment, she was 22 again. Then she opened it. Gideon stood on the other side, older, grayer, more fragile. but unmistakably the same man. Neither of them spoke. 57 years stood between them. All the words they had swallowed, all the questions they had never asked, all the birthdays, Christmases, funerals, lonely nights, lives built separately around a wound neither had ever completely understood. Gideon looked into Evelyn's eyes. For the first time in more than half a century, he was standing in front of the woman he had never truly stopped loving. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. There were tears in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Then she quietly stepped back from the doorway. Not to welcome him, not yet, only to look at him one more time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost painfully calm. "You shouldn't have come, Gideon." He said nothing, because somewhere deep inside, Gideon understood something terrifying. Evelyn wasn't afraid of seeing him again. She was afraid of what he was finally going to learn, and whatever Theodore Ashcombe had left behind had not brought Gideon back into Evelyn's life to give them closure. It had brought him back because the truth about the night they separated was finally ready to be. Evelyn's words remained between them. "You shouldn't have come, Gideon." For a moment, Gideon simply stood there. He had imagined this meeting so many times over the years that he had almost forgotten what reality felt like. In his imagination, Evelyn had always been younger, sometimes angry, sometimes crying, sometimes forgiving him. But the woman standing before him was 79 years old, with silver hair, tired eyes, and a calmness that somehow hurt more than anger would have. She opened the door wider, not as an invitation, only enough to let him know she was willing to hear him. Gideon stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old books. There were photographs along the hallway, family gatherings, Christmas mornings, a younger Evelyn beside her parents, children who had grown old themselves. But there was no photograph of Gideon, not one. He realized that immediately. Evelyn noticed him looking. She didn't explain. Instead, she walked toward the sitting room. Gideon followed. Neither of them knew where to begin. For 57 years there had been too much to say, and somehow, now that they were finally together, every word seemed inadequate. Gideon finally asked about Theodore Ashcombe. Evelyn's expression changed, only slightly, but Gideon noticed. He had known that face once. It was the face Evelyn made when something hurt her, but she refused to show it. Who was he? Gideon wanted to know. Evelyn looked toward the window. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said something that left Gideon unsettled. Some questions, she explained, should have been asked 57 years ago. Gideon lowered his eyes. He knew exactly what she meant. He had been given the opportunity to explain himself all those years ago. He hadn't taken it. He told Evelyn that he knew he had hurt her. He admitted that he had made choices he regretted. But Evelyn didn't respond with anger. Instead, she quietly corrected him. He had hurt her. That much was true. But according to Evelyn, that wasn't the worst thing he had done. Gideon looked at her. For the first time since arriving, he felt genuinely afraid, because the betrayal he remembered had always been the beginning and end of the story. Now Evelyn was telling him it had only been the beginning. The following morning, Evelyn drove to Ashcombe House. She had avoided the property for years. Even after Theodore's death, she had refused to visit until the legal transfer was complete. Now she had no choice. The iron gates opened slowly. Beyond them stood a sprawling country estate, surrounded by old trees and overgrown gardens. Ashcombe House was beautiful, but there was something lonely about it. It didn't look like a place someone had inherited. It looked like a place that had been waiting for someone to return. Evelyn stepped through the front entrance. Dust covered parts of the furniture. The enormous hallway was quiet. Her footsteps echoed across the polished floor. She passed an old music room, then a library filled with thousands of books, then a long corridor lined with photographs. She stopped at one particular portrait, Theodore Ashcombe, older, serious, his expression unreadable. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment. She had known this man, but not in the way people might assume. She had never been his secret lover. She had never been his second wife. She had never asked him for money. Their connection was something much more complicated, something that had begun when she was young, something that had remained hidden because revealing it could have destroyed more than one life. Evelyn continued through the house. In one room, she found old records. In another, letters. Some were decades old. She touched one envelope, but didn't open it. She already knew what it contained. She had spent years pretending those words didn't exist, but Theodore had preserved everything. He had preserved the past because he believed one day Evelyn would need it. And now that day had arrived. While Evelyn walked through Ashcombe House, Gideon's daughter Rosalind was beginning to ask questions of her own. She had never cared much about her father's life before she was born. Everyone had a past. She believed some things were better left alone, but the inheritance changed everything. A woman Gideon had loved before her mother had suddenly inherited a fortune from a mysterious man. And somehow, her father's name appeared in the legal documents. Rosalind couldn't ignore that. She confronted Gideon that evening. She asked him whether he knew Theodore Ashcombe. Gideon hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Rosalind asked again. This time, Gideon admitted that he had met Theodore once, many years ago, but he refused to say why. Rosalind became suspicious. She had spent her entire life believing her father had simply made a terrible romantic mistake when he was young. Now she wondered whether there was something much bigger behind it. She asked whether Evelyn had been involved with Theodore. Gideon didn't answer. Rosalind interpreted his silence as confirmation. She began to believe that the woman her father had never stopped remembering had lived an entirely different life from the one he had described. Perhaps Evelyn had found another man. Perhaps Theodore had been that man. Perhaps Gideon had been the only person who never knew the truth. But there was one problem with that theory. Gideon didn't look jealous. He looked frightened, and Rosalind had never seen her father afraid of another man. That evening, Gideon returned to Evelyn's house. This time, he didn't ask permission to come inside. Evelyn had expected him. She sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea. Neither of them touched theirs. Gideon asked the question that had been consuming him. Why had Theodore left everything to her? Evelyn looked at the cup in front of her. Then she finally answered. Theodore hadn't left her the inheritance because he loved her. He hadn't left it because she was his secret companion. And he hadn't left it because he wanted to reward her. He had left it because he owed her a debt. Gideon stared at her. A debt? What could a man as wealthy as Theodore possibly owe a woman like Evelyn? Evelyn didn't explain. She simply told Gideon that some debts cannot be repaid with money. They have to be carried until the truth is finally acknowledged. Gideon asked what she meant. Evelyn remained silent. Then she stood and walked toward an old writing desk. She opened a drawer. There was no dramatic secret compartment, no mysterious locked box. Just an ordinary folder that had been kept carefully among decades of papers. Evelyn removed a photograph. She placed it on the table. Gideon looked down, and everything inside him seemed to stop. The photograph showed Theodore Ashcombe. But Theodore wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a much younger Gideon. The 2 men were outside a building Gideon immediately recognized, a building he hadn't seen in almost 60 years, his old workplace, the place where he had gone on the night everything between him and Evelyn changed. Gideon picked up the photograph. His fingers began to tremble. He looked at Evelyn. Then back at the photograph. How did you get this? Evelyn didn't answer, because she knew the more important question wasn't how she had obtained it. It was why Gideon had never told her Theodore was there that night. Gideon suddenly remembered something he had spent decades trying to forget. A meeting, a warning, a decision, and a promise. He remembered Theodore standing across from him many years ago. He remembered being told that Evelyn's future depended on what he did next. But there was something else, something he had never connected to Theodore until now. The woman Evelyn had seen him with before their separation hadn't been a lover. She had been connected to Theodore. Gideon closed his eyes. The memory came back in fragments. A car waiting outside. A conversation he wasn't supposed to repeat. A document he was told to sign. And Evelyn standing across the street, watching him. Watching the moment she would later remember as the beginning of his betrayal. Gideon opened his eyes. Evelyn was still watching him. She had known, perhaps not everything, but enough. For 57 years, Gideon had believed Evelyn walked away because she misunderstood what she saw. Now he realized something much worse. Someone had made sure she would misunderstand it, and Theodore Ashcombe had known exactly who. Evelyn returned the photograph to the folder. She told Gideon that Theodore had spent the final years of his life trying to correct a mistake that had destroyed two young people. But Evelyn had refused to listen. She had already built a life without Gideon. She had learned to live with the pain. She had raised herself above the humiliation, and she had promised herself that she would never allow another person's choices to control her future. Then Theodore died, and the inheritance arrived. Along with it came the truth she had spent decades trying not to uncover. Gideon asked Evelyn whether she believed he had betrayed her deliberately. She looked directly at him. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she admitted that she had believed it for most of her life. But now she wasn't sure. That uncertainty frightened Gideon more than hatred would have, because hatred meant Evelyn had made peace with her version of the past. Uncertainty meant everything could change, including the meaning of the last 57 years. Later that night, Gideon returned home alone. Rosalind was waiting for him. She asked what Evelyn had told him. Gideon said nothing. Rosalind asked whether Theodore had been Evelyn's lover. Again, silence. Then Gideon walked past her and went into his study. He opened an old drawer. Inside were documents he had not touched in decades. At the very bottom was a photograph. The same photograph Evelyn had just shown him. But Gideon had another copy. He had kept it all these years. And behind it was something he had completely forgotten. A date, a name, and a handwritten note from Theodore Ashcombe. Gideon read the first line. Then he stopped. His face changed, because the note contained a sentence that destroyed the one explanation he had lived with for 57 years. Theodore had written, "If Evelyn ever learns the truth, she must know that Gideon was not the man who betrayed her." Gideon lowered the paper. His breathing became shallow. If that was true, then who had betrayed Evelyn? And why had Gideon allowed himself to carry the blame for all those years? Across town, Evelyn stood alone inside Ashcombe House. She looked at Theodore's portrait, then at the same photograph, and quietly realized that Gideon had finally reached the point she had feared for decades. The truth was no longer buried. It was coming for both of them. And when Gideon finally discovered who had stood behind the betrayal that destroyed their future, he would have to face a question far more painful than whether Evelyn could forgive him. He would have to ask himself why he had remained silent for so long. Because the inheritance Theodore left behind was never really about the money. It was about a debt that had been waiting 57 years to be paid. The sentence on Theodore Ashcombe's note would not leave Gideon's mind. If Evelyn ever learns the truth, she must know that Gideon was not the man who betrayed her. For 57 years, Gideon had carried a different truth. He had believed that he was the villain in Evelyn's story. Now, for the first time, he wondered whether he had been carrying someone else's guilt. But there was something Theodore's note didn't explain. If Gideon wasn't the man who betrayed Evelyn, then who was? And why had Gideon allowed Evelyn to hate him for nearly 6 decades? The answer began with a night Gideon had tried to bury, a night that started with a desperate young man, an impossible choice, and a wealthy stranger who knew far more about Evelyn's family than Gideon ever imagined. 57 years earlier, Gideon was 24 years old. He had ambition but very little money. He worked long hours at a small engineering firm and spent nearly everything he earned trying to build a future with Evelyn. They were supposed to marry within weeks. Gideon had already promised her a simple life. It wasn't much. A small home, a modest wedding, a future they could build together. But Gideon wanted more. Not for himself. For Evelyn. He wanted to give her the kind of security she had never had growing up. Then Theodore Ashcombe entered his life. Theodore was already a successful businessman. He owned several properties and had influence in the town where Gideon worked. At first, Gideon believed Theodore was offering him an opportunity, a better position, a chance to earn enough money to give Evelyn the future he had promised. But Theodore wasn't interested in Gideon's ambition alone. He had been watching Gideon, and he knew something about Evelyn's family. Something Gideon didn't know. One evening, Theodore asked Gideon to meet him privately. Theodore didn't immediately explain why he had asked Gideon to meet him. He simply closed the office door. Then he placed a single folder on the desk. Gideon looked at it. There was no name on the cover, no explanation, only a date. A date that meant nothing to him at the time. Theodore told him that Evelyn was in greater danger than she realized. Gideon immediately asked what he meant. Theodore didn't answer. Instead, he asked Gideon a question. How much would you be willing to lose to keep Evelyn safe? Gideon thought he was talking about money. He said he would give up anything. Theodore looked at him for a long moment. Then he quietly replied, "Anything?" Gideon nodded. Theodore pushed the folder across the desk. Gideon opened it. Inside were several documents. He recognized Evelyn's family name, but before he could read further, Theodore closed the folder again. He told Gideon that there were things in those papers Evelyn could never be allowed to see. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Gideon demanded an explanation. Theodore finally told him that someone close to Evelyn was hiding something capable of destroying her family. But that still wasn't the worst part. Theodore said there was already someone watching Evelyn, someone who knew about Gideon, someone who knew they were planning to marry, and someone who would become desperate if they discovered how close Gideon was to the truth. Gideon asked what Theodore wanted him to do. Theodore leaned back in his chair. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he gave Gideon an offer. Not an amount of money, not a business opportunity. Something far more painful. Walk away from Evelyn. Gideon stared at him. Theodore continued. No explanation, no final meeting, no truth. No promise that he could return someday. Gideon had to make Evelyn believe he had chosen someone else. He had to become the villain in the story of the woman he loved. Gideon refused. At first, he told Theodore that Evelyn deserved the truth. Theodore agreed. Then he asked Gideon one final question. Would you rather have Evelyn hate you for the rest of her life, or spend the rest of hers regretting that you didn't protect her? Gideon couldn't answer. Theodore stood and walked toward the window. He told Gideon that he would have only one chance to make the decision, and once he made it, there would be no going back. Gideon left the office that night carrying the folder. But he never opened it, not because he wasn't curious, because Theodore had made him promise that he wouldn't, and for reasons Gideon would spend the next 57 years regretting, he kept that promise. What Gideon didn't know was that Theodore hadn't told him everything. The danger was real, but so was the deception, and somewhere between those two truths was the person who had been waiting for Gideon and Evelyn to separate. The night before Gideon ended their relationship, he barely slept. He sat alone in his small apartment, holding the engagement ring he had bought for Evelyn. He could have told her everything. He could have trusted her. He could have allowed her to decide whether the danger was worth facing. But fear won. The following evening, Evelyn saw Gideon with another woman. The woman was connected to Theodore's investigation. Gideon had arranged the meeting because he needed information. But from across the street, Evelyn couldn't hear the conversation. She only saw Gideon standing beside her, and Gideon saw Evelyn. For one terrible moment, their eyes met. He could have run after her. He could have explained. Instead, he stood still. He let her walk away. That was his real betrayal. Not loving another woman, not choosing someone else, but choosing silence while the woman he loved was breaking apart. Gideon remembered watching Evelyn disappear into the night. He remembered wanting to follow. He remembered taking one step, then stopping, because Theodore's warning returned to his mind. If you love her, let her hate you. So Gideon did. He allowed Evelyn to believe he had replaced her. He allowed her to believe their years together had meant less to him than she imagined, and he never knew that the silence he thought would protect her would become the deepest wound of her life. Theodore had never intended for the truth to remain hidden forever. He had promised Gideon that once the financial investigation was complete, he would explain everything to Evelyn. But the investigation became complicated. People denied everything. Records disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories, and the person responsible was closer to Evelyn than either man realized. Someone within her family had been helping conceal the financial wrongdoing. Someone Evelyn trusted. Someone who knew about Gideon and understood exactly how much Evelyn loved him. That person discovered that Theodore was protecting Evelyn, and they understood something else. If Gideon stayed with her, there was a chance Evelyn would eventually learn the truth. So Gideon had to disappear, not because he was the danger, but because he was the one person who could eventually expose everything. Theodore tried to keep the investigation alive. He preserved documents. He kept copies of financial records. He recorded names and dates, and he continued watching over Evelyn from a distance. But he never told her everything. Perhaps he believed he was protecting her. Perhaps he simply became trapped by his own silence. Years became decades, and by the time Theodore was old enough to understand the full cost of what had happened, the damage was already irreversible. Evelyn had built a life without Gideon. Gideon had built one without Evelyn. And the people responsible had grown old, believing their secret would die with them. But Theodore refused to let that happen. That was why he created the inheritance. Not as a gift, not as an apology, but as a final attempt to return the truth to the woman who had paid the highest price for it. The truth about Gideon's silence was only the beginning, because while Gideon was remembering the past, Evelyn was learning something else. Miriam Bellamy had come to visit her. Miriam had been Evelyn's closest friend for more than 50 years. There was something different about her that morning. She was carrying the weight of a secret. One she had carried for far too long. Miriam finally admitted that after Gideon disappeared, he had tried to contact Evelyn. Not once, not twice, several times. He had written letters. He had called. He had even waited outside Evelyn's workplace. But Evelyn had never known. Every message had disappeared. Every attempt had failed. And Miriam had eventually discovered why. Someone had intercepted Gideon's letters before they reached Evelyn. Someone had made sure she would never hear his explanation. Evelyn listened without moving. For 57 years, she had believed Gideon simply walked away. Now she was learning that he had tried to come back. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of forgiveness. Not yet. They were tears of grief. Grief for the young woman she had once been, for the years she could never recover, for all the birthdays Gideon had missed, for all the times she had wondered why she had not been enough. And suddenly, another memory returned. A memory she hadn't thought about in decades. The last letter Gideon had supposedly sent her. She had never seen it, but someone had once told her it never existed. Now Evelyn understood. Someone had lied. And that meant the betrayal that destroyed her life had not ended when Gideon walked away. It had continued afterward, quietly, deliberately, for years, perhaps even decades. And somewhere in the past was the person who had made sure two people who loved each other never found their way back. Evelyn looked toward Ashcombe House. For the first time, the inheritance no longer felt like a fortune. It felt like a trail Theodore had left behind, and if Evelyn followed it to the end, she might finally discover the person who had stolen 57 years from her life. But there was one question she wasn't prepared to answer. What would she do when she finally discovered who it was? Yes, the betrayal will be much stronger if it isn't simply someone in the family wanted money. Give the audience a specific person, specific financial scheme, and specific reason Evelyn had to be separated from Gideon, while still holding back enough information for the later reveal. I would revise the family betrayal section like this. Evelyn turned another page. Then she saw a name she hadn't expected. Harold Marlowe, her older brother. Harold had been dead for nearly 15 years. For most of Evelyn's life, she had remembered him as the protective older brother who had helped keep their family's business alive after their father died. He had been the one who taught her how to read the company's accounts, the one who told her which people she could trust, the one who had stood beside her after Gideon disappeared, the one who had told her, all those years ago, that Gideon had simply chosen another woman. Now Evelyn discovered that Harold had known the truth. Worse, he had helped create the lie. Theodore's records revealed that Harold had been secretly transferring money from the family business into another company he controlled. The amounts were small enough to escape immediate attention. A payment here, a property there, an account opened under another name. Over several years, however, the money had become a fortune. But Harold had made one mistake. He needed Evelyn's signature. After their father's death, Evelyn had inherited a significant share of the family property. If she married Gideon, she would have control over that share, and Harold feared that Gideon would eventually notice the missing money. So Harold devised another plan. He arranged for Evelyn to marry Edmund Carrington, the son of a wealthy business partner. The marriage would bring new capital into the family company. More importantly, Edmund's family had agreed to overlook several irregularities in the accounts. Evelyn would become the bridge between Harold's failing finances and the wealthy Carrington family. But there was one obstacle: Gideon. Evelyn loved him, and Gideon had no interest in marrying into wealth. He wanted a simple life with her. Harold knew that if Evelyn married Gideon, the arrangement would collapse, so he began quietly destroying Gideon's reputation. He spread rumors that Gideon was struggling financially. He suggested that Gideon was secretly seeing another woman, and when Theodore discovered what Harold was doing, Harold realized something terrifying. Theodore had evidence that could expose him. So Harold needed Gideon gone before he could tell Evelyn. That was when Theodore intervened. And that was why Gideon was offered the terrible choice that had haunted him for 57 years. Walk away from Evelyn, or risk exposing her family to a scandal that could destroy everything she knew. Evelyn slowly lowered the document. Her brother had not merely lied about Gideon. He had used her love as part of a financial rescue plan, and the man she had trusted most in her family had watched her spend decades believing she wasn't worthy of Gideon's love. But there was something even more painful. Harold had not acted alone. At the bottom of one document was another signature. A signature Evelyn recognized immediately, her mother's. Evelyn stopped breathing. Because suddenly, the betrayal was no longer one man's secret. It was a family secret. And Gideon had been pushed out of her life to protect a fortune that had never truly belonged to the people who controlled it. Now Evelyn understood why Theodore had waited. He had discovered Harold's scheme, he had discovered the Carrington arrangement, and he had discovered that Gideon had been manipulated into believing that disappearing was the only way to protect Evelyn. But Theodore couldn't simply expose everything. Not immediately. Harold had already destroyed financial records. People who could testify were frightened, and Evelyn herself had refused to listen whenever Gideon's name was mentioned. She was too hurt, too proud, too determined to build a life without him. Theodore tried once. Evelyn refused him. He tried again years later. She still refused. Eventually, Theodore realized that forcing the truth upon Evelyn would only make her feel betrayed again. So he waited. And he spent the rest of his life collecting evidence. Every account, every letter, every intercepted message, every agreement involving the Carrington family, and every piece of evidence connecting Harold to the scheme. Then Theodore created his final plan. He would leave everything to Evelyn, but not simply because he wanted her to have money. He wanted her to have something nobody had been able to give her for 57 years, the power to decide what the truth meant. Inside Ashcombe House, Evelyn finally found the complete file. There were no jewels, no hidden fortune waiting in a vault. There was something far more valuable: proof. Theodore had preserved the original financial records, showing how Harold had moved money from the family business. He had kept copies of Gideon's letters that never reached Evelyn. He had preserved the original agreement between the Marlowe and Carrington families. And then Evelyn found the document that changed everything. It was an old marriage agreement. Her name was written across the top. Beside it was Edmund Carrington's name, and beneath both names were financial conditions that would have transferred control of Evelyn's inherited property to the combined family business. Evelyn stared at the page. She suddenly understood. They hadn't merely wanted her to marry Edmund. They had planned to use her marriage to secure control of everything her father had left her. Her love for Gideon had threatened the entire arrangement. That was why Gideon had to disappear. That was why the rumors had started. That was why the letters had been intercepted. And that was why Theodore had spent decades preserving evidence. The inheritance was never about making Evelyn wealthy. She was already entitled to what she received. The inheritance was Theodore returning to her the evidence, property, and choices that others had tried to take from her. But Evelyn wasn't interested in revenge. She stood alone in the library, and realized that the real question was no longer, "Who betrayed me?" She knew. The harder question was, "What should I do with the truth now that I finally have it?" That evening, Gideon found Evelyn in the library. He saw the documents spread across the table. He immediately understood. She knew about Harold, she knew about the Carrington arrangement, and she knew why Theodore had approached him all those years ago. Gideon didn't try to defend himself. He simply told her the part that belonged to him. He had been afraid. He had believed Theodore. He had convinced himself that Evelyn would be safer without him. But he admitted the truth. He could have trusted her. He could have told her everything. He could have allowed her to decide whether she wanted to fight for their future. Instead, he chose for her. He let her believe he had betrayed her. And even after he discovered that Gideon's disappearance had not solved everything, he stayed away. Because by then, shame had become stronger than courage. Evelyn listened silently. Then she asked the question that had been waiting between them for 57 years. "If you loved me so much, Gideon, why didn't you come back?" Gideon looked at her. This time, he didn't hide behind Theodore. He didn't blame Harold. He didn't blame fear. He simply answered, "Because I was afraid you'd look at me and realize I'd ruined your life." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, she understood something painful. Gideon hadn't stayed away because he stopped loving her. He had stayed away because he believed he had already lost the right to be loved by her. But that didn't erase what he had done. It didn't return 57 years, and it didn't mean Evelyn owed him forgiveness. The two of them stood in silence. Between them lay the documents that proved why they had been separated, and beyond those documents was an even greater question. Harold was dead. The Carrington family had moved on. The people who created the deception were mostly gone. So who, if anyone, deserved to answer for what had happened? Evelyn looked down at the inheritance papers. Then she looked toward the old garden outside. For 57 years, other people had made decisions about her life. Now, finally, the decision was hers. And what she chose to do with Theodore's inheritance would surprise everyone, including Gideon. The question remained unanswered. What should Evelyn do with the truth now that she finally had it? For 57 years, other people had made decisions about her life. Harold had decided whom she should marry. Theodore had decided what Gideon needed to know. Gideon had decided what Evelyn could handle. Even the people who had intercepted Gideon's letters had decided what she was allowed to believe. Now, for the first time, there was no one left to make the decision for her, or so Evelyn thought, because the next discovery would reveal that she herself had been carrying a secret all these years. The morning after Gideon's confession, Evelyn returned to her old home. She needed space. Ashcombe House had become filled with too many memories, too many documents, too many answers arriving at once. She asked Calder to help her sort through the remaining personal papers she had kept for decades. Calder had never asked too many questions. He knew his aunt valued her privacy. But while going through a stack of old correspondence, he discovered something unusual. An envelope bearing Evelyn's handwriting. It was dated nearly 30 years earlier. Calder almost set it aside. Then he noticed something written across the front. "If I ever decide to tell Gideon the truth." He stopped. He knew immediately that it was something Evelyn had never intended anyone to see. When Evelyn returned, Calder showed it to her. For several seconds, she simply stared at the envelope. Then she took it from his hands. She didn't open it. She already knew what was inside. It was a confession she had written to herself. Years after Gideon disappeared, Evelyn had begun investigating what happened. She had discovered inconsistencies in Harold's version of events. She had noticed that some of Gideon's supposed letters had never reached her. She had found financial records that didn't make sense, and eventually, she had begun to suspect that Gideon had not betrayed her in the way she had believed. But Evelyn had stopped searching. Not because she didn't care, because she was tired. She had spent decades rebuilding herself. She had created a life. She had raised a family. She had learned to wake up without wondering whether Gideon would ever return. And when the first pieces of the truth appeared, Evelyn faced a decision. She could reopen the past, or she could let it remain closed. She chose silence. Not because she wanted Harold protected, not because she wanted Gideon punished, but because by then, the people involved were old too. Harold was already aging. The Carrington family had lost much of its influence. Some of the people who had helped maintain the deception were sick or nearing the end of their lives. Evelyn couldn't bring herself to turn her remaining years into a courtroom. She didn't want revenge to become the final thing her life was remembered for. So she placed the letter away. She forgave herself for not knowing sooner. And she tried to move on. But now she understood why Theodore had never forced the truth upon her. He knew something Evelyn had also learned. Truth is not always the same thing as healing. Sometimes, knowing exactly who hurt you doesn't give you your life back. Sometimes, it only gives you another decision to make. And now Evelyn had that decision again. Only this time, she wasn't 22. She wasn't trapped by her family. She wasn't waiting for someone else to choose for her. She was 79. And she finally understood that she didn't have to spend the rest of her life fighting the past. She could decide what to build after it. Evelyn returned to Ashcombe House. Gideon expected her to be angry. Instead, he found her standing in the garden. She was holding the inheritance papers. For the first time, she told him what she had decided to do with the estate. She wasn't keeping it. She wasn't selling it. And she wasn't leaving it to the relatives who had once treated her inheritance like something they were entitled to control. Evelyn wanted Ashcombe House to become something completely different, a place for people who had reached old age believing their lives were already over, widows who had been forgotten, widowers whose children lived too far away to visit, older people whose families had abandoned them, people who had spent decades caring for everyone else and suddenly discovered that nobody was caring for them. Ashcombe House would become a place where they could stay, create, learn, garden, read, paint, make music, and simply belong. Evelyn wanted the estate to have a library, a garden, a music room, a workshop, a dining room where nobody would have to eat alone. Gideon listened quietly. He had expected Evelyn to use the inheritance as justice. Instead, she was using it as mercy. She wasn't going to let Harold's greed determine what the inheritance meant. She wasn't going to let betrayal define the estate, and she wasn't going to allow 57 painful years to become the most important thing she had ever done. The inheritance had begun with betrayal, but Evelyn intended for it to end with belonging. That was the secret she had kept from everyone. Not because she had been hiding wealth, but because she had been planning a future that had nothing to do with money. She wanted to give other elderly people something she had spent most of her life searching for, a place where they could begin again. Gideon walked through Ashcombe House that afternoon. For the first time, he saw the estate through Evelyn's eyes. The neglected garden, the empty rooms, the library waiting to be filled with new stories, the old music room that had been silent for years. He suddenly understood why Theodore had chosen this place for Evelyn. Ashcombe House wasn't supposed to be a monument to the past. It was supposed to become a beginning. Gideon asked Evelyn whether she needed help. She told him she had already spent too much of her life carrying everything alone. Then she looked toward the overgrown garden. There was one thing he could do: help restore it. Nothing grand, nothing that would erase the past, just the garden. Gideon smiled faintly. He understood the symbolism. The garden had once represented a future Evelyn had imagined with him. Now, decades later, it could represent something else. Not the life they lost, the life they still had time to create. So Gideon began clearing the old paths. He removed dead branches. He repaired the broken fence. He turned the soil. Evelyn watched from the porch. For the first time in many years, she smiled without forcing it. Not because the past had disappeared, but because the future no longer frightened her. That evening, Gideon found Evelyn sitting beneath the old tree in the garden, the same tree that appeared in the photograph from their youth. He sat a short distance away. Neither spoke for a while. There was no need. The truth was finally between them, not hidden, not distorted, not controlled by Harold, not protected by Theodore, not buried beneath Gideon's shame. Just the truth. Gideon finally told Evelyn that he wasn't there to ask for another chance. He knew he had no right to demand one. He wasn't asking her to forget. He wasn't asking her to pretend 57 years hadn't happened. He simply wanted her to know that he finally understood what his decision had cost her. He had thought he was sacrificing his happiness to protect her, but he had also taken away her ability to choose, and that was something he would regret for the rest of his life. Evelyn listened. Then she looked at the man beside her. The young Gideon she remembered was gone. The angry young woman she had once been was gone too. They were both old now, both carrying scars, both standing at the edge of whatever time remained. Evelyn began to cry, not because Gideon's apology erased the pain. It didn't. Not because she suddenly forgot everything. She didn't. She cried because, after nearly 60 years, the unanswered question finally had an answer. She finally knew why he left. She finally knew why he never came back. She finally knew that she had not been abandoned because she wasn't beautiful enough. She hadn't been replaced because another woman was more worthy. She hadn't imagined their love. It had been real. It had simply been destroyed by fear, greed, silence, and choices made by people who believed they knew what was best for her. Evelyn looked at Gideon, and for the first time, she allowed herself to say something she had not said in 57 years. She had loved him too. The words were not a promise. They were not a declaration that everything would return to the way it had been. They were simply the truth, and sometimes, after a lifetime of silence, the truth itself is a form of freedom. Gideon lowered his head. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't ask her to come back. He understood. Some second chances begin with romance. Others begin with forgiveness, and some begin with nothing more than two people finally being able to sit beside each other without carrying a lie between them. Evelyn looked toward the unfinished garden. Then she told Gideon there was still work to do. The garden needed planting, the library needed cleaning, the house needed people, and there were elderly strangers waiting for a place they could finally call home. Gideon looked at her and smiled. For the first time in 57 years, neither of them was trying to recover the life they had lost. They were beginning to build something different, something that belonged entirely to them. And Evelyn realized that Theodore's greatest gift had never been Ashcombe House. It had been the chance to decide what came next, because the inheritance had not returned her youth. It had not returned the years Gideon and Evelyn had lost, but it had given Evelyn something far more valuable, a future that no one else could choose for her. The garden was quiet that evening. The work had only just begun. Several paths had been cleared, but much of the garden remained untouched. Old branches still needed trimming. The flower beds needed new soil. The stone benches were worn from years of weather. Yet Evelyn could already see what the garden could become. Perhaps that was what age had finally taught her. You didn't need to see everything finished to believe something could still grow. For most of her life, Evelyn had measured time by what she had lost. The years with Gideon, the family she thought she could trust, the future she had imagined, the truth that had been kept from her. But now, standing in the garden of Ashcombe House, she found herself thinking differently. She had spent 57 years looking backward. She was finally ready to look ahead. Evelyn reached into the pocket of her cardigan. Her fingers closed around something small and cold. Her old engagement ring. She had kept it all these years, not because she had been waiting for Gideon, not because she believed they would somehow return to the lives they had once planned. Perhaps she had simply never known what to do with the last physical reminder of the young woman she had been. She looked at the ring in her palm. For a moment, she remembered the night she had taken it off. She remembered the pain, the confusion, the certainty that Gideon had chosen another woman. She remembered walking away believing her life had been broken because she had not been enough. Then she looked toward the garden. The same man who had once broken her heart was standing several feet away, quietly repairing an old wooden bench. He wasn't watching her. He wasn't asking for anything. He was simply there. And somehow that was enough. Evelyn walked toward a small planter where the first new flowers were beginning to grow. She knelt slowly. Then she placed the engagement ring beneath the fresh soil. She didn't bury it because she hated the past. She buried it because she no longer needed to carry it. The ring represented a promise that had never been fulfilled. But it also represented something else. The young woman who had once believed her entire future depended on one man's love. Evelyn had finally outgrown that belief. She covered the ring with soil, then she stood. Gideon had turned toward her. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. There was no dramatic embrace, no promise that they would suddenly become the young couple they once were. They were too old for pretending, too wise for fairy tales, and perhaps too honest now to confuse forgiveness with forgetting. Evelyn simply walked toward him. Gideon waited. Then they began walking through the garden together, slowly, side by side, not toward the past, toward whatever remained of the future. The next morning, Ashcombe House would begin its transformation. The library would be opened. The empty rooms would be prepared. The garden would be restored. And eventually, elderly men and women who had spent years believing they no longer mattered would walk through those gates. They would find somewhere to sit, someone to talk to, a place to create, a reason to wake up, a reason to believe that growing older did not mean the story was finished. And that was what Evelyn had finally understood. The inheritance had never really been about money. It had been about choice, the choice Harold had stolen from her. The choice Gideon had once taken away from her, by deciding what was best. The choice Theodore had spent his final years trying to return. And now it belonged entirely to Evelyn. For 57 years, she had believed the greatest tragedy of her life was losing the man she loved. But sometimes, the thing we spend our lives trying to recover isn't the person we lost. It's the part of ourselves we left behind with them. Evelyn never got her youth back. She never got those missing years back. She couldn't recover the birthdays, the ordinary mornings, the conversations, or the life she and Gideon might have shared. But she finally received something more important. The freedom to decide what the years ahead would mean. And perhaps that was the greatest inheritance of all. Not a house, not a fortune, not even a second chance at love, but the realization that her story had never ended when Gideon walked away. It had simply entered a chapter neither of them understood yet. And as the evening sun settled over Ashcombe House, Evelyn walked beside Gideon through the garden she had chosen to give to others. For the first time in decades, she wasn't wondering what might have been. She was grateful for what still could be. Because some dreams are lost, some are delayed, and some wait quietly for us to become brave enough to dream them again. If you were Evelyn, would you forgive Gideon after learning the truth, or would some betrayals simply come too late to repair? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that no matter how many years have passed, it's never too late for another chapter, subscribe to Dreams Never Grow Old.